So we're gathered here to hear Bishop Heath Light tell us what a bishop does, what he's done for 17 years. We're honored. We've never had a bishop here before. We've had all a variety of speakers, but we're honored to have Bishop Light. Came here from Norfolk some years ago. Bishop.
Well, one thing a bishop does is when George Kegley asks him to do something, because George is who George is, you tend to do it, and I told him I'd do anything he asked me to do. Possibility maybe of voting for Mr. Trump. At any rate, he asked me to come and say what a bishop does, and in that context, I called Martha Boulakis, who is the wife of the present Bishop of Southwestern Virginia, and she is contemplating the possibility of picking up the history of the Diocese of Southwestern Virginia, which was, the present book was published in 1978, I think, and I became the bishop in 1979, and Martha's going to pick up and carry through, and I thought if she wanted to get some idea of the way I think about things, or some perspective, why she might come and listen, and she was kind enough to come. George asked me to do this and say what a bishop does, frequently thought of as office people, administrators, and in many senses we are. If you manage a $1 million enterprise and have thousands of volunteers scattered around, it does take some administrative time, and that's one of the dimensions of it. It's also an office deal. You go to the office every day, as Martha knows, and as I knew, but you're also in a different congregation every Sunday, and that's different from what people are accustomed to thinking about, that if you're in an office and don't get out. So you're a traveling salesman, as it were. But one of the things that the prayer book calls us to do is to participate with the church in any global concerns of the world and of the church itself. And so you're a traveling salesman in another sense, in the sense that your perspective is global, and that means that you have plenty of opportunity to get out of the office. Most of the bishops that I knew complained about interruptions to their work, and when I became the bishop, I found a little sign that I put beside my telephone to remind myself that interruptions are my work. That's what I did for a living, was being interrupted frequently, often, and pleasantly most of the time. You're also the chief pastor of a variety of congregations, in our instance about 60 congregations, and the various clergy who serve these congregations, and the retirees who come here to live because of this area. After I retired, I visited a place where there was a retired old priest whom I knew was crotchety and acerbic, and just for fun, I went in the night before and picked up the telephone and called him. And I said, "George, this is God. I called to inquire about your spiritual health." And George recognized my voice and said, "You go to hell." So much for being chief pastor, and then being the beloved chief pastor. At any rate, there are various aspects of the job. We are called to be a guardian of the faith, and we, in the Episcopal Church lately, well, from 100 years ago, we had a schism that started in Philadelphia, and we had one about the time I was elected in 1976, and so we get into some arguments about the faith, needless to say. But that's one of the things that we're called to do, is to be what they call guardian of the faith. The other quality that's in the prayer book that they ask us to emphasize, and that I certainly found myself balled up in very deeply, was the business of participating in the leadership of the church throughout the world. I'll say a little more about that in a moment, because that was the thing that took an enormous amount of my time. But to say you're a traveling salesman reminded me of a tale they used to tell about Bishop Tucker. This diocese, which is in the southeastern corner of the state of Virginia, the western third of the state of Virginia, essentially on the line from Charlottesville to the North Carolina line, to the West Virginia line, Kentucky line, Tennessee line. But before this diocese was formed in 1919, Bishop Tucker was the bishop of Southern Virginia, from which we split, and he lived in Norfolk. So he traveled all the way from the eastern shore of Virginia, which borders on Delaware, out to Bristol and beyond. And the story is told about Bishop Tucker that he was on the train one time coming west, and when he made these visitations out here, it took him 2 or 3 days, of course, and the conductor came by to pick up his ticket, and he apologized. He said, I can't find my ticket. And the conductor said, well, that's all right, Bishop. You travel us all the time. If you say you had a ticket, you had a ticket, and we'll take your word for it. He said, that's fine, but I can't remember where I was supposed to get off. So being a traveling salesman can be confusing at times. Mark perhaps doesn't know where he's supposed to park his car some days, I'm sure. But it's an interesting life. But the thing I want to emphasize is the transition between Bishop Marmion, who was my predecessor. He was 25 years bishop of the diocese from 1954 until 1979. And I want to comment on him and the issues in his life, and just comment in passing in the issues in my life. But he became the bishop, as I say, in 1954, and he was consecrated, which is ordained, set aside, designated as the Bishop of Southwestern Virginia in 1954, immediately after the Brown versus Board of Education. Sometimes leaders impact events, and sometimes events impact leaders, and when leaders and events impact each other, I suppose that's called history. But that colored his episcopate dramatically, and affected mine to some degree also. But when the Brown versus Board of Education judgment came down from the Supreme Court, Bishop Marmion said that's the law of the land, and that's the way we will do it. And they had just bought a piece of property called Hemlock Haven out near Marion, where he wanted to establish a youth conference center. And he said, well, we'll open it integrated. That's the law of the land, and that's the way we'll do it. Well, much of the leadership was part of the Bird Machine, and the Bird Machine was totally reactionary against segregation. And so many of the leaders in the diocese did not support him in this. And I have tried to research and find out for sure whether the story is true, but one of the stories is that the second year Bishop Marmion was here, he didn't have a budget. They wouldn't pass a budget because he said he wouldn't open Hemlock Haven unless it was integrated. And they said, we won't pay to open an integrated conference center. And so they went without a budget, and congregations simply supported him throughout that time. That taste of that began in 1954, ran throughout Bishop Marmion's episcopate, and slopped over into mine in 2 or 3 different ways. One of the events in my life was that I was a classmate with the first black resident of the Virginia Theological Seminary. His name was John Walker. and he was probably the brightest guy in our class, or one of them. And he ultimately became the Bishop of Washington. But before he became the Bishop of Washington, while we were still students in seminary, and this was in the 50s, John and I became friends, and my wife and I were married in 1953, and we were married in Suffolk, Virginia, in the Episcopal Church there. And we invited people in general, and John came and participated in the wedding. And this was 1953. This was a year before Brown versus Board of Education. My wife's mother was frightened that nobody was going to show up because there was going to be a black man there. And the reality is that I think people showed up who weren't even invited because they came to see the race riot. Neither one of which happened. John took part in the wedding, came to the reception. I went down the receiving line, and shortly behind him, this social arbiter of Suffolk, who was Mrs. Rawls, but she was sort of comparable to a Fishburne or a Parrott or a Boxley or somebody in this town. And she came down the steps and walked over to the corner where John was standing off to one side. And he was black as the ace of spades, and so he's easily recognizable. And she said, "You must be John Walker, and we're glad to have you here." And that was all it took. So, as I say, John and I had some long associations, and when I was elected bishop here, he was the Bishop of Washington, and I asked him to come and preach. He preached when I was consecrated, made the Bishop of Southwestern Virginia. And afterward, after my consecration, I took the time to go to each of the convocations, 5 convocations in the diocese, with a schedule, and indicated that I wanted to make myself known to them more intimately than they had had an opportunity to get to know me previously. And I went to one of those convocations and very briefly introduced myself and said that I wanted to get to know them better and wanted them to get to know me better. And the first question that came was, "Bishop, why'd you have that nigger preach at your consecration?" Well, I was so angry at the use of that obscene word in a public hearing, and I could hardly answer him. But I finally did answer him, and I told him what I just told you, a very long friendship. But it was a startling thing. That controversy began in 1954. I was consecrated in 1979, and it wasn't dead by then. It didn't. And I don't think the race issue has been solved yet. We're still in the middle of trying to work it out. One of the other historic events that took place at the same time was the revision of the Book of Common Prayer. And the Book of Common Prayer to an Episcopalian is sort of like Martin Luther is to the Lutherans, or John Wesley is to the Methodists, or John Calvin is to the Presbyterians, or the Pope is to the Roman Catholics. The prayer book is our constitution, as it were. And the prayer book in 1976 was changed from exclusively traditional language to include traditional language and contemporary language. And it was in this context that more recent schisms took place. But part of the reason that the schisms took place was not just the changing of the wording of the prayer book, the change of the coinage of the prayer book, if you will, but it also allowed for the ordination of women, which was very controversial at that stage of the game. When I came here, there was one woman ordained a priest, and she was having to make a living as a social worker in Bartow County. But she was doing supply work at St. James here in in Roanoke, out near the airport where St. James is. And because of she was there, the Sunday before I was consecrated, I went to worship there, just to be with her and let her know that I felt that we were moving in the right direction with the ordination of women, even though she couldn't have a parish at that stage of the game. Well, now I bet you almost 50% of the clergy in the diocese are women. A vast number have come in and taken their place in congregations and in leadership in the church. And this woman who had to make her living as a social worker was Deborah Honley, whom some of you probably know. At that time, her name was Deborah Hintz. But she was part of the result of the change in the prayer book. Another thing that came along about the same time that I was consecrated was the whole issue of gay and lesbians. And I used to have dark hair years ago. That caused me some gray hairs. Cost us one congregation that left because of the willingness of the Episcopal Church to welcome gay people and lesbian people. And that issue, as I say, began about the same time I came here. And so we argued that, various and sundry, at various levels and in many different ways. My roots are as deep in southwestern Virginia as anybody's, I suspect. So I'm not exactly a newcomer who comes in with a lot of strange foreign ideas to the state of Virginia. One of my grandparents was elected the governor of Virginia to succeed Thomas Jefferson, and he happened to be elected when the General Assembly was meeting, retreating from the Richmond area in Stanton, and he happened to be elected at Trinity Church Stanton, which is an interesting sort of route that I have. I was also born in Lynchburg. I was raised in the little town of Chatham, which is only about 60 miles southeast of here. So I've got pretty deep roots, and it's not like I come with an agenda to try to tear down something, because I'm appreciative of the historical perspective, and I'm grateful to be part of it in some rather intimate sorts of ways, as that indicates, I hope. I said there were schisms by the time I became bishop, and early visitations. I was consecrated in June, and one of my early visitations was in Amherst County, where a member of the clergy there had decided that he could not stand the ordination of women and the changes in the prayer book, and so he departed from the Episcopal Church and did his best to take the congregation and its modest endowment with him. And so we had three little congregations in that county, in Amherst County. One was north of the town of Amherst, where they were worshiping because the member of the clergy persuaded the congregation to continue to use the church in Amherst, and so I was excluded from going there. But we had a congregation in the north end of the county, and we had another one in the western fringes of the county, which was basically a Native American congregation. And I'd had a morning service north of the county, and started through town on my way to the Native American congregation in the western part of the town. And I realized that all these people were coming out of church and going into the parish house at Ascension Church Amherst, which was the one that had departed at that stage of the game. And among them was a whole group of people with purple shirts on. It happened to be the day before the court case opened that really has set the pattern for the whole business of the possession of property between the Episcopal Church and people who disagree with it throughout the country. But this was the first case, and that case was to start on Monday, and these several gentlemen in purple shirts were there to be witnesses for the schismatic portion of the congregation. Anyway, when I saw them moving from the church building outdoors and around the corner and back into the parish house, I simply went in there and began to introduce myself around, because I didn't know them. I was fairly new too. But one little boy said within my hearing, holding his mother's hand, said, "Mama, is that the man you said that's going to take our church?"
Oh, gee.
So, yeah, you know, there's strange ways of feeling unwelcome, and that's one of them. But as it turned out, well, we did go to trial, and we did get a judgment. And they ruled that the Episcopal Church was a hierarchical church, which I think of it as very democratic, because we as the bishops are elected by a majority vote of both representatives of the congregation who are lay people and all the clergy. And they have to concur in the election. So it's a representative democracy. It's not similar to the United States in the sense that our ruling system is sort of like the ruling system of the United States, which is understandable since some of the same people wrote all the same canons, wrote all the same laws. So, but one of the realities is that this controversy in Amherst set the tone and has not been reversed since that judgment in 1979 that indicated that the church was a hierarchical church, and therefore the episcopate, or the Episcopal Church as church, had control of the property, and we got that property back. And talking about the control of things, George, how much time do you want me to take?
Well, keep going.
I delivered some stuff before Mark became the bishop here to our office building, which is over on First Street, and it was some communion silver. The 2 chalices, cups in which we share the wine at communion, 2 chalices, and a paten, a plate on which you have the bread and you distribute the bread with that. So I took it to Evan's house before Mark became the bishop and left it there. One of them, my mother, a very sentimental soul, had gotten her hands on one of them as a root. Well, let me tell you how we got our hands on it, period. My grandparents stole it, if the truth were known. They used to keep the silver at their home in Russburg, and this little congregation was closed, and the 2 chalices and the paten were in my grandparents' house, and the grandparents distributed it among their children, one of whom was my mother, who got a chalice. And when I was ordained a priest, she put my name on it, a little bit to my embarrassment. And we had the paten also, but she didn't put my name on that. But the first visitation I made to Big Stone Gap after I was consecrated bishop was we're in the western end of the diocese, and different people in the community were invited to come and meet me as the new bishop. And one of the ladies was a member of the Presbyterian Church, and she said yes, she was invited to come to the luncheon, and she was glad to be there. And she was particularly glad to present me this chalice that had come through another aunt who married somebody in Big Stone Gap. And so the chalice went back to me, with me, to Evan's house, to our office here. So it ultimately all got returned to the diocese, but it was rather circuitous, and I must say a little bit embarrassing. But at any rate, it worked. I don't want to say a word about what attracted my attention in the exercise of the episcopacy. Obviously, it's an honor, and it's a privilege to be in this position, and I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful that God has given us Mark to be a successor. But the part of the job that somehow caught my attention was the whole business of world mission. And I spent a great deal of time with that. We established a relationship with the Diocese of Bradford in England. And because the city of Bradford had a lot of Pakistanis in it, they were concerned about establishing some sort of relationship with some people, some Muslim people, Pakistanis. And we were interested in trying to reestablish our relationship with the black people in southwestern Virginia, most of whom disappeared during the height of the hostilities between blacks and whites. And different congregations have small segments of black membership, but we were interested in holding up black people as a symbol of our interest and concern in the worldwide mission of the church. And so the Bishop of Bradford and I agreed that we would not only have a relationship between these two dioceses, but also we would go and invite an association with the Sudan in East Africa, which was an emerging powerhouse in the Episcopal Church and has since been decimated by a long-running civil war. But we did establish that relationship, and so we had a three-way partnership between southwestern Virginia and Bradford, England, and the Sudan in East Africa. And out of that, I got interested in world mission through the General Church. And I served 3 years as chair of the Joint Standing Committee on world mission. But it took me all over the world, to Africa frequently, to England often, to Central America, South America, Japan, Australia, lots of places. And it was a great privilege to be part of this worldwide communion. And it's a thing that we don't often talk about, but it's a significant part of our life, this association. And that brings me to the present circumstance, which was not widely publicized, but is a reality. At a recent meeting of the heads of the various what we call provinces, each country may have one or more provinces in it. England, for instance, has 2 provinces, the province of Canterbury and the province of York. We have 1 province in the continental United States, including all the United States, Hawaii and Alaska and all that. But then there are other branches of the Anglican Communion that also have elected leadership, like we have a presiding bishop. And they call them different things. They call them archbishops in some areas. But they're sort of what we laughingly call the first among equals. They're the big guys, and we try to collaborate and participate. Well, just recently, our presiding bishop, a man named Michael Corey, who was relatively new in the job, was invited to a meeting in England in which some African bishops who were very much concerned about the fact that the U.S. Church has authorized the marriage of gay and lesbian people to each other. Now, I mean, not lesbians to gays, but lesbians to lesbians and gays to gays. And this is obviously a matter that is still in controversy and under critique from a lot of people. But Bishop Corey, our presiding bishop now, was invited to go to the meeting of what they call the primates. And they don't call them primates because they're ape-like. They call them primates because they're the head of these provinces of the Anglican Church throughout the world. And at that meeting, some the conservative group largely from Africa, black bishops, black primates, introduced a resolution inhibiting the participation of the U.S. Church for 3 years. And our presiding bishop was there, and he made the following response, which I will only read part, but he was straightforward and I think right on target. He said, the Anglican Communion is not a matter of structure and organization. The Anglican Communion is a network of relationships that have been built on mission partnerships, grounded in faith, relationships in companion diocese relationships, relationships parish to parish across the world, relationships that are profoundly committed to carrying and following the way of Jesus of Nazareth by helping the poorest of the poor and helping the said, we are still a part of the Anglican Communion. He was speaking for the Episcopal Church, and it wasn't like we were kicked out of the communion. We weren't. We were simply disciplined for a period of 3 years. And it's interesting, once every 10 years, they used to have a gathering of all the bishops in the world, all the Episcopal bishops in the world. And Mark may not have that privilege as in 2018, and because it's on the 8 years, 18, 28, 38, because we are inhibited. I don't know how that's going to shake out, whether we'll be invited to come. That's the privilege of the Archbishop of Canterbury, to invite whom he chooses to invite. And I'm not sure that the primates of the communion have the right to inhibit anybody from coming. But we'll see what happens to that. And but Archbishop Carey, Presiding Bishop Carey, said, we are still part of the Anglican Communion. It is part of our vocation to help the communion and to help many others to grow in a direction where we can realize and live the love that God has for all of us, and that we can one day be a church and a communion where all of God's children are fully welcome. And I think that is enough said about what the Episcopal Church has done with the authorization to solemnize marriages between gays and between lesbians. But as I say, events sometimes affect leadership. Leadership sometimes affect events. But where events and leadership come together, there's history. And I think Bishop Carey has made history for us. You all may have some questions, and I'll be glad to try to answer any questions you have.
Comments from anybody?
I have one.
Fire.
With all your experience and with all the things that go on in the world now, where do you see things going?
Well,
You can take anywhere you want to go.
I am very comfortable with where the Episcopal Church is. I'm left of center, and I don't mind admitting that. But I'm very comfortable with the Episcopal Church and its role in terms of inclusivity of all people. It seems to me we get in by invitation from Jesus, and all we're doing is extending the invitation that we have received to invite other people in. So I'm quite comfortable with that, and if this means that we lose some members, I regret that, but it is a philosophy that I would like to have my name numbered in behalf of. Is that the sort of thing you were asking about?
That's part of it, yeah.
Yeah. You want to be more specific?
There's so much turmoil in the world that outside of what I'm not really speaking of what's the church, but how do we do those things, and how would the church help to settle the world back down and get people to live together versus trying to fight each other?
You know, my hunch is that that's a legitimate desire of all of ours to see things settle down. But my understanding of creation is that what God moved God moved into the midst of chaos, and out of this began to form the world. And I think the chaos was all scooped up in it. And this is just the nature of the way things are, and we just either going to have to learn to live with it or develop ulcers, one or the other. Phrase that Mark has lit on that I think is a legitimate position is to talk not in terms of self-preservation. Jesus didn't talk in terms of self-preservation. You don't have to rig it and think of it in terms of whether the membership is growing or losing. Bishop Hines, who was a great presiding bishop of the U.S. Church, and said of Bishop Marmion when he retired, said his Christian charity outlived his severest critics, which was a great compliment, I think. But anyway, Bishop Hines said it may be the role of the Episcopal Church to die, but we have pretty good record of what has happened to one who died, talking about Jesus and the resurrection. So if it happens, it happens. But the thing that Mark Borlakis is leading us toward is called a missional church. That the church, rather than concentrating on numbers, must concentrate on mission. And he is bringing in leadership to work at that, and he is organizing on the basis of that. And it may be that is what Bishop Curry was saying when he says that our mission is to be Jesus' church. Well, I thank you. And I thank you for the invitation to be here.